Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciated that song. Thank you so much. This is a great way to start the evening. Everyone, welcome to Grief Support, the Therapy Edition, an event hosted by EOL's Wander community and myself, Elisa Fornere. The Wander community is a space to gather as we navigate grief. And through Wander, I'll be hosting this monthly event, as well as our other monthly series, which is called Griever's Guide to. And in these events, I'm convening leaders and professionals in the death and grief spaces so that audiences like y'all can feel actively supported as you move through death and loss. So as I said, I'm Elisa Fornere, pronouns she, her, hers. I am a convener, a consultant, a speaker, and an educator working in the grief space. I got into this work in 2016 after my mom, Deborah, died. And ever since, I have been actively working to amplify and convene resources and works from people like our guests today. So you can learn more about me at the links that the wonderful Jessica from EOL will throw into the chat. But most importantly, really, as I always say, like what you need to know about me is that I am here today to hold space for y'all and to hold space for these speakers to talk about the incredible work that they do in the world to support people like you. A little bit of housekeeping and just sort of opening here. Because this is a Zoom webinar, you'll be able to view all of our faces and the speakers' faces. But even though you can't see your own and we won't see yours, I highly encourage you to interact with us in the chat. So I'd love to have everyone who's here tonight throw in the chat where you're dialing in from and the name of a person who you are here honoring tonight. For me, I am dialing in from Riverside, California, and I am honoring, as always, my mom, Deborah. If you'd like to ask questions, you can throw them in the chat or DM me specifically and privately. I will get those over to the speakers. And I can also ask them anonymously if you'd like to send them directly to me. This video will be available as a recording after, and you'll be able to find more information about this work and everyone's work in the different like resources that we'll send out after. So we'll send out a follow-up email and there'll be information on the Wander page, which we will also throw a link to in the chat. And then last but not least, as I said, I am in Riverside, but I am on Kauai and Tonga land in Southern California, and I am here tonight. And especially as the sun is coming out and we are getting deep into summer, I am very aware of the privilege that I have sitting in this office, sitting at this desk, back in this region of the world on land that I do not own. And if you'd like to learn more about the land you're taking up space on, Jessica kindly will throw the chat to nativeland.ca to understand where you are, who that land belongs to, and your relationship to it as a settler if you are one. So thank you for joining from wherever you are. Tonight, we are here to talk about therapy and therapeutic support. The reason I wanted to have this conversation to kick off this series is because there have been a lot of conversations about therapy, counseling, and support over the last year, particularly as we've been navigating COVID, loss, death, and just so much grief, whether that was grief that existed before everything with the pandemic happened, or grief that has come up and bubbled up for you in the last year. And for a lot of us, I know for myself at least, grief that's compounded with many things over the last year that I have needed to seek professional support for. We can find therapy in so many forms now, on Zoom, phone calls, text messages, in person again soon, in groups, but not all of us are comfortable with the concept of therapy. Not all of us are comfortable with the concept of something being therapeutic. Not all of us are comfortable talking to strangers, doing this work publicly in groups, etc. So I wanted to have a conversation about it in the context of grief. How to get therapy, how to use therapy or get therapeutic support in different modalities to support us while we're grieving. So I've gathered 4 wonderful human beings here tonight who I will introduce. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about their work, and then my invitation to each of them is a prompt to just quickly introduce themselves and answer the question, when and how did your relationship with therapeutic practices start, to understand sort of where they're at their journey and where they started. So I'm going to start with Naila. Naila Francis is a writer, grief coach, death midwife, and ordained interfaith minister. Naila holds space and offers rituals for people at many of life's sacred thresholds, from birth to and marriage to death and other transitions. Naila brings a compassionate presence and open heart to everything that she does. And for many years, she worked as a journalist before finding her way to work of companioning others through grief and dying after suffering several personal losses in her own life, including the death of her father. And the reason I invited Naila here tonight was because Naila's willing to speak about her experience going into therapy and counseling as a person who was grieving after the death of her father. So I wanted really both perspectives from people who offer this support and from people, who have received it. So Naila, my question really to you, again, that I pose is, when and how did your relationship with therapeutic practices start?
Thank you very much. I am dialing in from Philadelphia here on Lenai Lenape land. And my relationship with therapy began and ended very quickly in college. I went to one session and I sobbed the entire time, and I felt so awkward and uncomfortable that I never went back. And then I later on was parts of lots of like healing circles and community type healing events, but didn't really try therapy again until my mid 20s, when I suffered a crisis, I will say, in my romantic partnership that I was in. And did that for a while, but found that I was really kind of working the therapy. Like I would go in with angles, and I didn't, looking back now, I didn't truly feel supported in that process. And then when my dad died, I really committed to therapy for real. I was like, okay, I need to do this, and I need to allow the process to be what it's going to be. And I stuck with it. I found a really good therapist, and I incorporated other things along with that, but that was so, so instrumental in my grief healing process.
Thank you for sharing. I'm excited to dig into, especially like what I'm hearing, that sort of in and out, learning how to trust the process, learning how to find a space that was good for you. So thank you for sharing. And next, I'd like to introduce Paulina Almarosa. So Paulina is a bilingual licensed clinical social worker in the state of California. She was born in Morelos, Mexico, and lived most of her life undocumented, an experience that has greatly shaped and influenced her work as a mental health therapist today. So Paulina holds a BA in psychology and social behavior from UCI, a master's degree in social welfare from UCLA, and she has over 10 years experience in the mental health field. Paulina is the founder of Latinx Grief, a space dedicated to demystifying and amplifying grief, specifically in the Latinx community, through grief education and grief support services. So Paulina, I open that question to you. When did your relationship with this work and therapeutic practices start?
Wow, what a loaded question, right? I really want to say that my relationship with therapy started when I didn't have access to therapy, and when therapy wasn't spoken about in my household, even though so many of my family members, including myself as a child, needed that support, needed that therapy. And that really set me off, I think, on a personal journey that started very young. I think I remember reading my first psychology textbook when I was in 6th grade, of understanding what it is that we all need as human beings when it comes to psychological and mental health. And then thereafter, that became my path, and professionally and personally too, because I have suffered, and I say suffered because it was suffering, multiple losses throughout my life. And even though I was training to become a therapist, I had a similar experience like Naila's. I went to therapy one time in college, and I never really went back because it didn't feel like I was being supported. And so tried it again, and same thing happened. And I kept thinking, wow, what's happening? Is it me? And I've come to realize that it wasn't. It's about, finding somebody that fits you and somebody that is there to support you. And so I've set out to do that for myself in my personal life, and then also professionally, by creating spaces for people, particularly Latinx communities and people of color, to feel supported in that process. And that is why I'm here and how I got here in a nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I'm excited to get into that, the identity piece of it, and what makes a good fit based on your background, your identity, et cetera. So thank you for being here. Next, Rebecca. Rebecca Mullins, thank you for joining us tonight. Rebecca founded Studio Saudade to provide grief and bereavement support through educational programs, consulting, design, and creative services. Her company guides people through the process of telling their stories to honor and commemorate lives lived and loved ones lost. Rebecca is the program designer and a licensed facilitator for the studio's Healing from Loss programs and workshops. In addition to 18 years in the design and creative fields, Rebecca brings several years of professional experience in training in end-of-life, death, grief, and loss support. And after her own experiences with compounded loss, she saw a great need to advocate for others during life's most vulnerable and challenging moments. Rebecca's passion is to support clients navigating these waters with wisdom, love, laughter, and meaning. Rebecca, thank you for joining me. And yeah, questions over to you.
Okay, I'm calling in from Seattle, Washington, and acknowledging that Seattle is on the accustomed lands of the Coast Salish, Stillaguamish, Duwamish, and Suquamish peoples. So my relationship with, I think, grief and therapy started kind of similar to Paulina, like from a very, very young age. Always had sort of an interest in reading books about psychology and things. And I came from a traumatic sort of early childhood background. And there was a part of me that always sort of looked at, I think, grief and loss, even though I didn't have the vocabulary when I was a kid. But I knew that that was such like a huge part of my experience, and that it was kind of the starter for a lot of like emotions and things that we just couldn't really talk about. And so my work, it took me a very long time to actually have the courage to do it. And it kind of came to me in my, I'd say like late 20s, when I lost a very, very dear friend. She was a mother figure. It was very sudden. And she was a woman I worked with. There was a lot of complex relationships going on. And I was just going to school as a designer around that time. So I was experiencing a really significant loss, but my brain was on a creative side. I was learning all these new things. And it was just this very sort of complex time. And that was back in 2006. And then fast forward about 10 years, I was starting to have a lot of sort of like symptoms of depression, or just feeling like super unhappy, and I didn't really quite know. And so I sought out a therapist. And I remember walking into her office and saying, I think I've got like unresolved grief and I don't know what to do, but ever since my friend died, like nothing's been the same. And 6 years have gone by. And so I explained a bit of what I was feeling, and she just said, no, this isn't grief. It's not fitting in any of these things. And she asked questions. And then fast forward about, another 6-7 years later, and I was seeing her again for other just basic stuff like work-life balance and burnout, and just things that I was sort of, experiencing. And I had a huge crisis at that time, a loss of severe health crisis. My business had exploded, like all these things were going on. And after treating with her for another solid like 2 years, the very end of it, one of the last sessions she told me is, you've experienced a profound amount of loss in your life. And instantly I was like, and we never did any kind of grief work together. And it was all therapy, and it was incredibly beneficial. But then I sort of started about 2017 is when I really hit hardcore, like, okay, how do I take what I can do in creative stuff and connect it between a lot of the therapy that I've had and learning from that, but also this huge wealth of creative resources that I sort of, think of as sort of my mother tongue. So that's where Studio Saudade came from, was establishing this very intricate path. And now here I am doing my work full time. So
thank you. I'm really appreciating this thread, which is my experience too, of the in and out and in and out. And I'm looking forward to chatting about that with all of you. So thank you for sharing, Rebecca. Ken, last but not least, Ken Breniman is a licensed clinical social worker, a registered yoga therapist, and a thanatologist with over 15 years experience working with bereaved individuals and families. Ken was 18 when his mother died from cancer, and he's dedicated his life to holding space for others when they are confronted with the often unwelcome yet inevitable teachings that death and loss bring into our life journeys. Ken has been offering yoga for grief workshops, which I've attended, in the Bay Area for over 10 years. Ken, thank you for joining. The question is over to you, and then we'll jump into some larger questions for everyone.
Thank you, and it is an honor to be here. I'm beaming in from Oakland, California, humbly sitting on Ohlone land, and this is such an interesting question because with hindsight, I would say when I first needed therapy, I was about 7 years old when I was immobilized when my first pet died. And I lived in a family where there wasn't much emotional availability or attunement. So I lived my life up until age 18 when my mom died and went to a funeral. People cried a little bit, closed the casket, we're done. We're not going to talk about her anymore. When I got into college, I went to a therapist, very similar thread here. And this therapist was probably the best therapist I could ever hope to have made contact with. But I was so shut down. So years later, after giving myself some distance, living overseas for many years, circled back to the United States and decided to go to social work school. And as part of my education, I went back to my college and asked for the notes from my few months with this therapist. And this therapist asked me if I was gay. I said no. Am I grieving my mom? I say no. Like he was very sensitive to all the places, but I wasn't budging. So what I found as a social worker and a therapist and a yoga therapist is that implementing all of these practices that aren't necessarily talk therapy, like bringing the body in, bringing the spiritual side in, often having very experiential therapeutic interventions as opposed to trying to talk through something that the body or the spirit really have to navigate through. So coming full circle, I still love birds, and I'm so glad to be in this conversation with you all.
Thank you, Ken. I really appreciate that. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. Just talk therapy is amazing. You know, many of us on this call, it sounds like we've had experience with it, but there are so many other ways to access that therapeutic support. So I'm going to open it up, you know, as I mentioned to all of you in advance of this call, some of these questions might feel pointed based on your background and the work that you're doing, but they are open essentially to everyone. So comment freely. My first question here, though, is pretty general. What do you have to say to people who might be on this call or listening who are freaked out about the concept of going to therapy for the first time if they've never been, or who have been and had a really bad experience but know they might need to go back? How can they settle into this conversation and coming back in the ways that it sounds like some of you have experience with?
If it's okay, I'd like to start just in naming the first thing that came to my heart, which on either end, seeking a therapist or being a therapist, I think one of the most arduous and almost difficult parts is about shopping around for a therapist, making the calls, checking out emails, websites. And I think that, you know, especially when we're in a place of perhaps grief or feeling somewhat disempowered in coping with something, that it's really hard to stand in that place of empowerment and search for someone that is really a good fit. That time-consuming first process, I just want to really empathically name that is sometimes a rite of passage in modern psychotherapy world, but I think it is worth it to really search and do due diligence to find a good fit. As everyone here said, that we found people that weren't such good fits sometimes. So that's the first thing that comes to my heart.
Can I chime in? It reminds me, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the work of Dr. Edward Reinerson, that he's here in Seattle, Virginia Mason. He's been a psychiatrist for 56 years. and created a program called Restorative Retelling, which is a bereavement. It's a therapeutic model that really helps people that have suffered a violent or traumatic death. And after 56 years of doing this work, he said, grief is not something that, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with seeking help. This isn't a diagnosis. This is not a disorder. This is not, the things that we want to put into these boxes. And I loved how he said, grief is a rite of passage. This is something you go through like adolescence or whatever. And we don't seek therapy because we're a teenager. It's like our bodies are going through something. And I really admired how he was such a seasoned professional. And he's like, this is something that we all experience, and there's nothing wrong with you to go seek therapy or help. You need support around it. But we oftentimes just want to put these names and labels on it. And so then we think we've got something maybe wrong with us. And grief is this very ambiguous sort of field where like therapy helps a ton, but the experience itself, when you're going through bereavement, it is its own little niche. And so I just always really appreciated that, because you think something's wrong, you're broken, or you're not, processing things right. And so I just throw that out.
I think for me, what comes up is this idea of confidentiality, especially I think for me, and just thinking about the idea that you're always in control of the session. It is your session. So if there's something, I think sometimes there's fears around not wanting to share certain things, or fearing that the therapist might ask you a question and you're going to have to answer it and you might not be ready. And what's that going to look like? So it's really, I think what has helped some of the clients that I worked with and myself is coming in with a lot of questions and allowing the therapist to guide you, and not feeling like you're the one that always has to be in control, or that you're forced to say or do anything that you don't want to do. I think that comes with also feeling empowered to say, no, this doesn't feel good to me. Can we try something else? And ultimately, if it's not working, being able to say, this isn't really the relationship that I had hoped, and it's not me. I think maybe it's not, our styles are not working. Can you recommend me to someone? I really appreciated clients who sometimes were honest with me and said, you're really awesome, but there's something here that's not, I've been fired. So I'm going to expose myself. I have been fired. And I understood that it wasn't really about me. There are some things sometimes that maybe it was like, I'm at the time, right, I was too young, or they thought, oh, well, you remind me of someone I knew. You just never know. And I was like, oh, okay, I get it. Let me help you find someone. So if just know that also most therapists are there to help you, and they want to see you succeed, even if it's not with them, even if it means referring you to somebody else that would be a better fit.
I just wanted to chime in and also say, especially when it comes to grief, and I also echo a lot of what has already been said, but I think it's super helpful to have somebody who has experienced grief, which when I went to therapy for losing my dad, I didn't even think to ask that. But now in my work as a grief coach, I have so many people come to me whose therapists haven't experienced grief because they don't feel that they can have that space, like they're not holding that space for them, or they want to pathologize their grief and be like, well, it's 6 months, like you should be getting better by now. And so echoing what Paulina said, that idea that like, and also Rebecca, that there's nothing to fix, you're not broken, like this is a process, and we're going to be in this process together for as long as it takes.
Y'all are answering my questions, which is lovely. One of the other ones that I have left in this more general bucket is, well, no, let's move on to identity, because I think it's kind of playing into what some of you were talking about, Ken, what you mentioned earlier, and what I've had conversations with a couple of you about privately is, when it comes to finding someone and finding therapeutic support, regardless of whether it's talk therapy, or if you're going into art therapy, or you're doing a yoga class with someone who's teaching it, how can finding someone who reflects your lived experience, whether that's your background, your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, how can that added layer of understanding, kind of like what you're talking about, Naila, of like having grief experience already. How does that play into creating a more supportive environment, or potentially an environment where you can connect with someone who's supporting you better? And Paulina, I'd love to hear from you, particularly because of the work that you do for the Latinx community.
You know, I think that having a space where you feel like somebody understands, or at the very least looks like you, or has a similar background, that alone sometimes can help people feel at ease, because there are things that they don't have to explain to me, that I can understand. And so we skip over that work in a sense, right? And we get down to it. We speak the same language, and it can create this like almost like instant, bond that creates safety and trust. But what I want to say though is that there is a misconception sometimes that the person has to be of your background, look like you, have the same experiences, and that in itself can sometimes actually be why. And this is what we as therapists call, right, like transference and countertransference, because then we get really overly involved, right? So we always as therapists have to check that too. And so I want to say that yes, it's important to find somebody who shares the same values as you. And so I recommend for people to have a list of questions that they want to ask, particularly if you're BIPOC, around race, around what, that person has done to become culturally sensitive, attuned, competent, whatever it is that you want to, call it, and what that process has looked like for them, to really do that interview to see if they're a fit, and also recognize that sometimes help can look like someone that isn't you. And I will say that I have had one of the best therapists for me was a white male. And I was shocked. I was like, what? How? And it was because we had similar personalities, and he was like nurturing and had some of those things that I was looking for. Versus when I have gone with other people who look like me, and there was too much for me. It's like, oh, that person reminds me of my mama. I can't do this, right? So I think it's about personal preference, but also recognizing that identity always plays a role, and that some people might not feel safe with you if you don't look and come from the same background or have the lived experience, because lived experience is also so important. And so it's complicated, I think. I think it's complicated and it's individual, and everybody's going to be different. And so I always say I don't like generalizing, because again, look at my experience, right? Like I'm working with somebody that doesn't look like me, and it's working out fabulously. So really feel it out and see what it comes out of it, and how you feel in your body when you're with that person. I think it's an embodied experience. Is what I've come to realize. And maybe Ken can speak of that embodied experience and being in your body when you're in therapy, and how you feel when you're connecting with that therapist, I think is important too, more than the talking sometimes.
This is amazing. We only have an hour.
We are only supposed to be here for 45 minutes,
okay.
but
right.
We'll get through it.
Yeah, Paulina, what you're saying it feels so relevant. And of course, I want to overstate the case by case. I do feel that there is something almost visceral or intuitive that if we come to know whether it's a good fit or not, that's very telling. And one of the first 4 agreements is don't take anything personally. So if it isn't a good fit, like we've all said, that to be able to step away from that therapeutic relationship and keep seeking support is really key. There's something about also just my personal opinion, and my approach is to work very relationally. And the older I get at 51, I think the more nuanced approach to relational therapy with grief tends to work well. That I can show up and I can say, yes, I've had loss, and it's not about me. And to be able to be there, as opposed to maybe some of our earlier training is Rogerian, be the blank slate, don't ever show pictures of your family in the office. So I think being interactive and allowing that person to feel safe in that way has come to be an approach that I think in grief therapy has worked well for me. And how can I not be relational if I'm moving my body with them, and if I've got if I've got backaches or something, I have to name that as a disclosure. So there's ways in which that has felt inviting for the client, and it's not for everybody. Sometimes once they know so much about a person, that can be, like you're saying, that is too much. And so I think both the somatic and the relational piece is really key in the evolving relationship.
Thank you. One of the questions that I had in general was about what therapeutic practices and support that aren't talk therapy can provide us with while we're navigating grief. So Rebecca, I wanted to talk about art and the creative process. You know, Ken, thank you for speaking to the body, but I'd love to talk specifically about yoga. I've been in your class. I'd love to hear more about that. And Naila, Paulina, anything that you've experienced in terms of grief support that hasn't been sitting in a room across from someone or on Zoom, across from someone having a conversation, and how that's impacted you while navigating your grief. I'd love to hear about that too. But Rebecca, I invite you to open this part of the conversation.
Sure. So I trained as a graphic designer. That was my initial sort of entry into the creative arts. And as I mentioned, my good friend died. It was sudden, and we had to go through the entire funeral experience, which she died in 2006. And it was kind of your traditional experience of going into this really, stuffy funeral home, and they put out the list of like funeral programs that you can choose from. And I remember just being like, no, these are awful. They're so icky. Like the woman I lost was beautiful, and she nothing fit like it was her personality, in these sort of what they literally called merchandise. And I remember just thinking like, I'm going to do it myself. I don't know how to use the tools yet, but I'm going to get a graphic designer friend and we'll put these together. And so it was my very first experience, designing her programs, and having to go through the design process. And it was someone that we'd just freshly lost. And I remember when we were done with it, we got the PDF, and it was 4 hours of working on this thing. And my friend we looked at each other, and we both just started bawling. And it was seeing her name with her date on the, from, 1948 to whatever. It was seeing that in print was the very first moment of oh my God, this is real. It was such a specific thing for me. And it started off this, for me, it was kind of this very sacred practice of we do these things, whatever that might be in terms of art or design, whatever, but we have these rituals around what we do to memorialize someone. And for me, it was very much about typography and that person's story and that narrative, and all the images, that you work with when you're pulling together someone's life. And we try to fit this incredibly rich life on a front and back of a sheet of paper folded. And it's just this thing where it's you can never possibly put together that rich life in this thing. And that was my first experience. So I kind of knew then, I loved working in this space and working with families that are so vulnerable and raw, and they can't make sense left or right. They're trying to put the story together in a very linear kind of factual way about someone's life. And oftentimes that's when the stuff comes out, where it's there's anger, or there's I'm so pissed off that my, whatever. And it's you're kind of just there as a listening companion to just hear them go through this process, but it's so fresh and new sometimes. So that was my early experience with creative stuff. And then since then, it's really grown a lot into, I do hospice volunteer work, and a lot of, way back when I was always sort of the person within friends and family that would always be either at the deathbed or really trying to change the experience of what was going on, either through shifting the room around. Our physical space is different. The experience about it is so incredibly important. And adding in the component of how the bodies are going through, and how do you move in a room, and what does that feel like? And is it stuffy? And is it, just that creative thing of let's move some things around spatially, and how does that shift what's actually going on and what comes up in a room? So that's a little bit about kind of my experience, what I've done with it. But in a lot of my research in the last few years, there's just such a big tie with obviously creative practice with grief specifically, and how, journaling and painting and a lot of movement in the body can really, really, that's the part that kind of unlocks you know, like we can talk about a story all day long, but until you like viscerally feel it somewhere and you have that muscle memory where things are being stored, a lot of the work can come just from a somatic approach. So I'm still learning about, you know, the different ways to approach that with myself and with clients, and doing a lot of breath work and just really trying to like, okay, I've got to use my imagination here when things are really intense. And, you know, I feel like I can't breathe and I'm having, you know, it's like, okay, I need to kind of go into my body and just really dive into that pain and a lot of mindfulness, and then use my creativity and my curiosity to kind of just be with those emotions. And then see where that ends up taking me on a creative level afterwards. So sorry, I hope I was talking too much. I'm gonna
No, thank you. Thank you. And Naila, I know you do writing prompts and you offer these kinds of things in the work that you do. So I'm curious if you have anything to add about, you know, processing grief in ways that have nothing to do necessarily with talking to another human being.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will also say that even my therapist, when I went to therapy after my dad died, she was an EMDR therapist, which is a way of helping release the energy of trauma that's stored in the body. So it was a combination of talk therapy, but also these processes that we could do that could kind of discharge what I was holding from the stories that were really painful to me. And that was one of the reasons that I sought her out, because I knew that like I had had experiences with talk therapy where I was like, I can just talk my way into anything she wants me to say. So I really wanted somebody who was going to kind of challenge me and create that space to move stuff out of my body. And then in my own journey after that, I also did a poetry writing group for grief, which is part of where my own writing practices that I bring to clients and in my social media and everything come from, because I think there's something really powerful about getting out of your head and putting a pen on paper, especially when there's no thinking. Like if I give you a prompt and your pen's just going across the page with that prompt and you're not thinking, like you never know what's going to come out of that. So I'm always encouraging people just to like keep writing until you feel like you've hit the deepest truth, or maybe something you didn't even know was there. Like what comes out when you sort of take your mind and your story out of the picture.
Thank you for that. I appreciate just the concept of sort of letting things flow out, whether it's through movement, writing, talking, and any of these modalities. It sounds like that can be incredibly useful to just sort of release, it sounds like. I have a question from someone, Kat. It's for Paulina and Ken. They just started working toward their master's in clinical mental health counseling, and they are aspiring to be a grief therapist. And they're curious, do you find that your own journey with loss has strengthened that therapeutic relationship with clients?
Yeah. Yes. 100. Yes, absolutely. I think it has. I think that, like Naila was saying, I think lived experience is important, and sometimes it gets left out of the conversation. And I think Ken started to speak about how initially we're trained to be these blank slates, and early on in my career, I was that very blank, and I took off my wedding ring, and I didn't want anybody to know anything about me. And I found that created sometimes, right, a very distant and cold environment. And when I went through my own losses, that really shifted everything and brought me back to being a person who wanted to connect with others on a more, I guess, real, authentic level. And so experiencing a profound loss fundamentally changes us as a person. Then that too changes us as a professional. It changed me as a professional. There are things that I was like, I'm kicking myself now. When I was an intern in hospice, I was like, how could I have said those things to people who were grieving, people who had gone through loss? Like, I kick myself for making those mistakes. I've forgiven myself now because I know I was very early on in my career. But absolutely, now I have a different lens where I can attune to things that other people might not catch. right? Because grievers, sometimes we have a very specific way of saying things, of doing things, and not everybody, right? Because but there's universal truths that tie us together. And much like trauma, and I can kind of catch that a little bit easier than I did before. And I'm a lot more compassionate and sensitive. And those are things that I was before, but loss really deepened that. It pushed me to really examine and reflect and do the work on myself. And that in itself made me, I want to say, a more human therapist, not a better therapist, but I think a more human person in the room. And so I wish I hadn't experienced that loss, but fundamentally it has changed me.
I just have to say that absolutely, I don't want to take up much time in that other than to say, I don't know how we can do this work without letting our own experience guide us, and to let that part of us come in, and almost the essential self can show up and say, okay, yes, there's a grieving young boy still sitting here, and he may need to go cry after this session. I'm going to take care of him now and stay present with your experiences. But I don't know how to do this work. And in fact, it was my mom's death that I dedicate every yoga for grief, and I light a candle before I sit with clients when they're bereaved. So there's a lot of guidance in my personal experience when I sit with someone, and I don't want to make it about my experience.
Thank you for that. I feel like we've just had a 5-minute conversation to start a 40-hour conversation. I'd love to, we have a couple minutes left, and the way I'd love to close this tonight is to hear from each of you. If there are people watching this or people here tonight who feel like, okay, y'all have convinced me, I probably need some support. But I don't know where to start, whether it's with art, whether it's with yoga in the body, whether it's with talk therapy, whether it's with just looking for a therapist like we talked about. I'd love for each of you to share, I don't love the word advice, but advice or guidance to people who are like, where do I even start tonight or tomorrow? So any of you can open, and that's just, I'll let y'all talk until you're done, and that's how we'll close this evening. And I guess I'll just offer, Naila, I'd love to have you kick it off, and then we'll go from there.
One of the things I would say, and I really appreciate this about Ken's sharing, is kind of noticing what's in your body and what feels good in your body. That's often where I start with things. Like when my dad died and I heard about this poetry group that was being led by this poet whose daughter had been murdered, and she was doing this for grief support, like everything in me was like, yes, this is a space I want to be in. So I think before kind of making that leap and being like, oh my gosh, I'm going to go open, like go on Google and find a therapist or whatever, just kind of get quiet and maybe even think about things that have been helpful to you in the past or things you tend to gravitate to, and just see how that lands with you. And then take sort of that body wisdom with you on your search for what you want to do.
I would ask everyone to close their eyes, and especially all of us getting through perhaps the most intense year and a half of any of our lives. And if we think of one or two people in our life, and I hope that everyone can come up with one or two that you could go to and say, I think I need some help. Can you help me search for this therapist? And you already have a support team, which will be an essential part of working with therapy. You'll have someone to talk to after the therapy session. This is what I learned about myself. So if there's someone in your circle that could also support you in that search, I think that that would be really important.
All right, I'll chime in. I love what's already been said so far, and I'm totally agree. just to get quiet, listen, figure out, okay, that person or those people exist somewhere, and you trust that you're gonna have the right fit through the right therapist or whatever, and you trust your body when you know that's the right thing. That being said, if you're anything like me, you'll jump on Google and research and go down rabbit holes of all kinds of things. And I don't know how many, hits on grief books on Amazon. It's like 50,000 crazy links. And so it's really sometimes daunting to figure out, like, do I want to read a book? Do I want to book an appointment with a therapist? Do I want to, try that? And your personality has so much to play into it as well. Whether you tend to be a lot more quiet, more introverted, more reserved, and are you going to feel a little bit more cautious, just kind of like taking your own steps at first. So maybe that's just through reading or observing or reading online stories of other people. Like, that's okay too. Some people just really need to have, like, a group support to go to, and it can be so many options now online. But just really experiment and just be open. And if there's one experience that wasn't good, don't give up seeking support. Something else will come up, and then you'll feel really good about it. There's incredible therapists that have written beautiful books on grief. And so those all exist. So definitely ever reach out to anybody on this. And if you need resources specifically for something, there's a good chance one of us will know, okay, if you're looking for that, here's a few resources. And people I know in this work especially are so generous, and they want you to find the best support that's going to fit. So just ask, and that knowledge will come.
I want to say, okay, I'm gonna just take it back to, okay, do y'all remember when you were like maybe looking for a partner and you would have a wish list, or maybe it was just me, and I would like write down, oh, I wish he was like this tall and had these qualities, and so I think it's kind of like that. It's that before you go looking, you understand what it is that you're looking for. Do you want somebody who is, a lot more, I don't know, more reflective? Do you want somebody who commands a presence? What do they look like? Even that's important. What is it in your mind when you close your eyes and you feel safe? What is a person that you feel safe with, and what does that person look like? How do they talk? What do they say to you when you're sad? I mean, all of these things, and you just journal it out. And that way you understand, okay, these are some general qualities that I'm looking for. And then a list of non-negotiables, things that you absolutely could not tolerate. For example, I had clients who somebody said, I fired my therapist because she would drink coffee. It was so random, right? But like little things like that, where you know what you want. And so then that search, you can kind of narrow down. And then if you have extra time, getting familiar with some of the theories and the lenses from which people work with, right? So that you understand if you're going to go more cognitive, if you're going to go more yoga, and what you're going to feel safe in. And then the last part is looking at directories where you think these people are going to be. So if you're looking for somebody who's Latinx, right? We have Latinx therapy, who has Latinx therapists. If you know that doesn't really matter for me, then you can go on Psychology Today and find more general people. So then that narrows down what databases you're going to look at. And I say this as a person who likes to plan, because I, worry, and apparently warriors make the best therapists. So I like to plan. And if you go in with a plan, I think it eases some of that anxiety, because then you really do know, this is what I'm looking for. And this is not it. And this is, that voice was too shrill. That is my advice for you, is approach it like you would dating. Have a wish list, and be okay with that, and know that you deserve that wish list.
Thank you all so much. This was like the best sort of closing to this event ever. Practical advice. Y'all shared some really lovely stories, and I think approached this from so many different angles. I'm really grateful. I am going to pull a bunch of resources that y'all mentioned, including that database that you just mentioned, Paulina, and other grief resources that I've been collecting for the last year and a half. And we'll send that out to everyone. Obviously, you have links to all of the resources from everyone who joined us on this panel today. And, like Rebecca said, I think one of the things that I would recommend is people like us are out there. We're on Instagram, we have emails, we have websites. for me, I would say for a reason, like contact me. It is my job to help people find resources. That is the work that I do. And asking people like us who are embedded in this community or who talk about resources on a regular basis can be a really beautiful place to start, because we've been building lists for a long time. So thank you again, all of you who joined us tonight. And thank you to everyone on this panel. Again, like I said, I could have done this for another day and a half, but I'm just really grateful that we started this conversation tonight, and I'll be sharing a lot more about you and your work with everyone after this evening. And thank you, Jessica from EOL. I really appreciate you doing all of the tech for us tonight. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.